Hi guys, welcome back to Less is More. My name is Dan Wellman and today we'll continue looking at mixins, this time looking at an aspect of their usage called pattern matching. Pattern matching with mixins is where a mixin is defined several times with slightly different values, and the mixin that is finally used when the file is compiled is decided by the arguments that are used, conceptually a bit like a switch statement in JavaScript. A good example of the usefulness of pattern matching with mixins in Less is with box shadow and text shadow styles. They both take very similar values in a very similar format, with just the name of the property that differs. We can create a single mixin that we can use for both properties. So we'll add one here and we'll call it shadow. So we'll just define the arguments that are passed in. So this is the version of the mixin used for text shadow. And now we'll define the second branch of the mixin. And we've got to give it the same name, so this is shadow also. And we specify the arguments once more. And this time it's a box shadow. Okay, so two versions of the mixin, both called the same thing. Now, the first argument in both of the mixins is not a variable, it's a pattern. So when we want to use this, if we want to use a text shadow, then for the first argument we specify text, whereas if we want to use a box shadow, when we use the mixin, we specify box as the first argument instead. It's a special value that's not actually used anywhere inside the mixin. So let's have a go at using it. So we'll look for text shadow. Here's a text shadow. And our mixin is just called shadow. And because we want to use text shadow, for the first argument we need to specify text as the pattern to match on. We'll separate out all the arguments. So now when we compile this, if we look for the div container #3, let's have a look. This is the one here. Yeah, and there's our text shadow, as we would expect. So box shadow is not used anywhere in the theme that we're working with, but if we wanted to use box shadow, then we could do this. So the same mixin name, this time the first argument is box. And then we can just add the same arguments here. And now when we compile that, here it is, and let's see what we get. So we get the text shadow, and then we get the box shadow. So there's one thing to be aware of. When we're using pattern matching with our mixins, we can't use the arguments special variable, because otherwise we would get the word text or the word box. So if we try to use arguments, it's going to compile, but when we look at the actual code that we get out, that's not what we want. That's going to break our CSS. So just be aware there, you can't use arguments when you're using pattern matching. So we can get rid of that because it's not actually needed. So this is simple pattern matching at its most basic form. We can also specify a default mixin that matches any and all patterns, which is useful for providing style properties that are to be set anytime the mixin is used. So for example, if we wanted to set a text style with our shadow mixin that was used regardless of whether it was a text shadow or a box shadow, we could add a default branch like this. So our mixin's got the same name. This time we use the special any variable. So we still have to specify the other arguments as well. but just because we've specified them, it doesn't mean we have to use them. So now, regardless of whether a text shadow or box shadow is used, we will get the text style italic. So we'll just verify that. So if we look again here, so yeah, text style italic has come out. So we specified the text shadow, but because we use the special any variable, which is the @ followed by an underscore, we also pick up the default styles there. As well as matching on a specific pattern, like the word text or the word box, we can also match on arity. So if you haven't come across the term arity before, that just means the number of arguments. So we can specify mix-ins that are matched based on the number of arguments instead of the presence of a specific keyword. So a good example of that is with using box shadows. So box shadows can be either a shadow that is outside of the box, or they can be a shadow that is inside the box, in which the inset keyword is used. So sometimes we might want to specify a box shadow outside of an element, and we wouldn't use the inset keyword. So we can have a mix-in that caters for both of these things. We'll call this one box shadow. And on the first branch, we specify just 4 parameters. And we'll just grab this from up here because we've already used it. And then we define another mix-in of the same name. So it's a different branch of the same mix-in. And this time we specify 5 arguments instead. This time within the mix-in, obviously we want to make use of all 5 of our arguments. Great. So when we come to use this mix-in, if we pass in 4 arguments, we will match the first branch, and if we pass in 5 arguments, we'll match the second. So box shadow is not used anywhere, so let's just have a quick few examples up here. Okay, that's great. And then if we want to make use of the second branch, then we just specify a different number of arguments instead. So now when we compile that, we get an error. And it's because I've not separated out the variables, so my apologies there. And I've probably done the same, yeah, I've done the same here as well, so let's just correct that. And we should find that this compiles now, except that it doesn't. And I've spelled colour wrong because I'm a Brit and we spell colour with a U, so that trips me up quite often. But that's compiled now, so let's just take a quick look. Yeah, that's exactly what we want. So that is how you match mix-ins based on arity, and because we're not using a special keyword, we can go back to using the super handy arguments variable, because it doesn't matter which variant is used, we want to use all of the arguments each time. So a bit more drier, a bit less repetition, and a bit more coolness, and it still works exactly as we want. So in this part of the tutorial, we looked at adding a little intelligence and a lot more flexibility to our mix-ins using simple pattern matching. This allows us to define mix-ins that output different styles depending on the value of the arguments that are passed to them. And as you saw, we can also match on the number of arguments that are passed in. So some really handy stuff. In the next part, we'll see how to use an even more advanced form of matching called guarding, which allows us to match on expressions instead of simple patterns. Thanks for watching.